Learn more about finding your family history by visiting the Ancestors website, where you can download pedigree charts, access online databases, and explore the ins and outs of genealogical records.
The Ancestors Research Kit, Tools for Discovering Your Family History, is now available. The kit guides users through the family history research process and includes instructional videotapes, the Ancestors Guidebook, and key genealogical forms. To order, call 1-800-758-0846. A series companion book, In Search of Our Ancestors, is also available.
Funding for the Ancestors series is made possible by a grant from the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation, proud to support the worldwide effort to bring families together, and by ancestralquest.com, helping families find their lost ancestors for over 50 years. ancestralquest.com.
Welcome to Ancestors. I'm your host, Scott Wilkinson. Today we'll explore cemetery records, those final records pertaining to the death and burial of your ancestors.
Cemetery records are usually the first tangible things that you'll see, because you go visit a cemetery, whether it's dry and weed strewn and got a few snakes slithering here and there, or if it's beautifully manicured green lawns, it's still where your ancestors rest. And so there is a almost immediate emotional bond. You'll touch the headstone, you'll walk on the grass, you'll walk around and see what else is written on that headstone. You check the graves nearby to see if there are relatives, and lo and behold, there usually are.
Beth Uyehara from Reseda, California, wanted to locate the grave of her immigrant ancestor. She set out on a search that eventually took her across country, where she hoped to find a monument that would connect her with her past.
Great-grandfather was always the mystery of the family, because I knew his name, which was Benjamin, because various uncles had been named for him. And I had information about his wife, Elizabeth Ellis. But aside from the legend that he was killed probably in a coal mining accident and that he had died young, I just really knew nothing about him. And we had no photographs. And it just seemed like he was a ghost, you know, he didn't really exist. And at that point in time, I had no idea where he had been buried or where he had died or any information about his life.
You might think a cemetery is just a cemetery, but that's not exactly the case. There are different types of cemeteries, such as church burial yards. This one here in Upholland, England, has graves dating back to the 1700s. Some cemeteries are dedicated to the military, like the Lorraine American Cemetery here in Saint-Avold, France. This cemetery honors over 10,000 American soldiers and airmen who gave their lives during World War II. Burial grounds like this can be found in the United States and abroad, and these cemeteries sometimes include the names of those who died in conflict, but whose bodies were never recovered. Other cemeteries are operated by local or regional governments, like this city cemetery. Each of these different kinds of cemeteries may have information relating to the death of your ancestor based on their ethnic background, where they lived, military service, religious affiliation. There's really a lot more to cemeteries than you might think.
When I go to a cemetery, I don't just see tombstones. I see families there. I see history there. I see much more than just a stone, but it tells me everything.
Cemetery records can contain many things. Of course, they're for the use of the cemetery office to know where people are buried. So it'll list the name of the deceased, the day they buried him, who else is in that plot, which can be very interesting, especially if it's a family plot, and you didn't know that the little baby or the mother-in-law is also there.
I had this sense of my great-grandfather that possibly I would never be able to find him or find out about his life. I wanted so much to know who he was and to know what he was like, and having not knowing where he was even buried seemed just terrible to me, that the family had moved on and left him behind, and he was the one who kind of brought the family here, and things really got better in the generations since then, and it seemed to me very sad that he was alone and that nobody was remembering him. I thought, if I could just find his grave, I just want to see it.
One of the problems, of course, is if you live on the west coast of the United States and your ancestor died and is buried somewhere on the east coast, the difficulty is locating the correct cemetery. Of course, it would be nice if you were independently wealthy and could take a trip and visit every cemetery in the locality, but that doesn't always work, and certainly not always feasible.
One way that you can find out where or what particular cemetery your ancestor's buried in is death certificates. Death certificates are pretty much a 20th century phenomena, though, so as you move further back, you're not going to have those death certificates. But that's one way to go about it, is finding or obtaining the death certificate for the deceased individuals, and more than likely it's going to have place of burial. And it's also going to give you, the death certificate would also give you the name of the undertaker, so you might be able to contact the funeral home and find out where they buried the individual.
In funeral home records, they will often have a copy of the obituary. Oh, and obituaries are a wonderful resource. When you have first-generation immigrant ancestors from the old country, whichever one it may have been, it will often say the town that they came from in the old country. And of course that's a gold mine, because you may not have known that before. You knew they came from England or Germany, but you didn't know where in either country. And so here in the obituary it says that they came from Outer Ulu Whoop Whoop in the year 1867. Oh, thank goodness, you finally got a town. And so you can go and look at that record.
When my mother was breaking up housekeeping after my father died, she was throwing out old photos and going through the attic, and I was trying to grab everything as she was throwing them out. One of the things she had was a clipping, and there was no date on it, but it was an obituary of my grandmother's mother. So I kept it. I didn't really read it or think much about it, but when I got it out some 30 years later, when I got into genealogy, I realized how much information was there. It told her parents' name, which was her maiden name, the town that she had lived in Pennsylvania, and when she had moved to Ohio. So, I mean, this was really invaluable. Just a tiny little clipping, but it was packed full of information. I started looking for my great-grandparents in the U.S. Census. I knew that my grandmother had been born in Wales, and I knew that she had been under the age of 4 when they came to this country, and she'd been born in 1869. So I knew they had to have been here in the early 1870s. I found my great-grandmother's name in the 1880 census, and she was listed as a widow. It obviously told me that my great-grandfather had died sometime between the time they came in the early 1870s and the 1880 census. It just narrowed down the field of search.
You can use historical and genealogical societies also to search out tombstone records, graveyard records. Some of the genealogical societies, historical societies have gone through and they've walked cemeteries and they've transcribed the records into notebook or into film form or into book form.
One of the biggest advantages that they have is that they are in the area and that they have an interest in these historical records. Many times they have indexed the cemetery records for that county that they're in. And they may not have published them. They may just have them in an index that's sitting there in their home or their office.
So your very best bet would be to write to a local historical society and ask if they have transcriptions of cemeteries and if they have indexed them.
It's often possible to get a member of the genealogical society to go and do the cemetery work for you. They will do it for not too much of a fee, or someone in their organization will do it.
I was very, very new at this. I think I started just trying to put information down somewhere in February or March. And by summer, it seemed to me I had exhausted all the resources of genealogy. And in the library, there was just nothing left. I would have to go there in person. I wrote to the Clearfield County Historical Society and said, I want to come back east and do some research, and I'd like to do research in your library, and I'm hoping to find where my great-grandfather was buried, and the best information I have is that he probably died in a coal mining accident in North Houtsdale. I got back this terrifically helpful letter from them saying, these are our hours and these are the days we're open, and we'll make sure you have everything you need. And if he died, then he was probably buried in the Brisbane Oddfellows Cemetery, which is on route such and such. And they gave me, the address, which I thought, that's amazing that they would know out of all the cemeteries in Pennsylvania. And of course, now I realize there's only one cemetery there. But I would never have found that out if I hadn't written to the Historical Society.
The kind of information that you could find here at a cemetery is staggering. And this may be why cemeteries are such a popular place of research for many genealogists.
Some of the information that you may find on the tombstones for individuals, other than, of course, the birth dates, the death dates of individuals, you may find the marriage, possibly a marriage date. You may also find, if they're immigrants, you may find the country of origin, where they came from, place of origin, maybe even a town name, possibly. You may even find, if he was a military individual or if he served in the military, they may have identified the unit that he served with in the military.
Usually when we think of cemeteries, we think of tombstones and grave markers dotting the landscape, but the physical markers are only part of the story. Not only can we find excellent information from the monuments outside, but we can also find an amazing amount of information from the documentation about the monuments inside.
In the variety of cemetery records or records that are generated by the burial of a person, if it's the sexton's records, you may find the name of the deceased, the date of death, the date of burial, the grave number, the plot number.
The cemeteries may have who owns the particular plot. It may not be the individual who's buried in the plot. It may be some other relative who's buried there. And you may not find just the individual's immediate family in the burial plots as well. You may find their daughter, but maybe the son-in-law.
The city will be similar to the sexton, except they usually have big books. I don't know why. Cities always have to have big books, and they'll go across the page. And if they do fill out across the page, they may even have the cause of death on there and the address of the deceased and where they died, if they died somewhere other than their usual residence. And if it was in the hospital, who the doctor was. If it's a church record, it will also give you the name of the minister, of course, and the sexton may include that as well, who the officiating minister was, if there was one. And so you can glean little bits of different information from all the different records. And so this is a case where I would strongly recommend you look at every one of them, whether it's an obituary or the sexton's record or the undertaker or the minister of the church, or whether it's the city record. Look at them all, because it just may be that one of them will give you a little bit of information that you didn't have before that will enable you to cross a gap to find some more information that you need.
Monument inscriptions and cemetery records are excellent sources of death information. In fact, they might be the only existing record available for some of your ancestors, especially women and children, who often were not mentioned elsewhere.
You might have a child who died between censuses, let's say, and before the vital records were actually kept in a particular county. Cemetery records may be the only place you're going to get that information. And sometimes a cemetery record will, for a woman, give her maiden name, which you might not have known before.
All I had was that this woman's name was Alma, and I couldn't find any information on her. So I went to each of the 14 children's birth records, marriage records, and death records, and she was not listed on any of them. In fact, the birth records all listed the husband, and under mother was his wife. Her first name didn't even appear. So after exhausting all these records, being a tombstone buff, I decided to go to the cemeteries, and when I walked into the cemetery, there she was, Alma Varney, wife of Calvin Carpenter, on the tombstone. So that was the only place her maiden name appeared in any record of any of her children or anything was on her tombstone.
So I planned everything, my flight back to eastern Pennsylvania and how long it would take me to drive to western Pennsylvania to Clearfield County, so that I would be there when the Clearfield Historical Society was open. And I went through everything they had, and there was no mention of great-grandfather. So I took the address of this cemetery and headed out, and just kind of found it by accident. I had never done any research in a cemetery. I mean, I just thought, well, gee, you walk around, and if you get lucky, you know, it just didn't seem possible that I would really find his grave, because he still seemed such a mystery. So I thought, well, I'll start here, and about 20 feet in was Benjamin's headstone. I looked at it, and it was Benjamin Ellis. Maybe there was another Benjamin Ellis. No, this has got to be the one. Finding the headstone was enough of a shock. I mean, I just hadn't been able to expect it to be that easy. I thought it was going to take a lot more work than that.
If you're one of the lucky few, you may be able to walk right up to your ancestor's gravestone. But for most of us, finding information within a cemetery, like any other research method, requires a lot of time, patience, and effort.
The cemeteries may not have records at all as far as who's buried in the cemetery. You may just have to walk the cemeteries, row by row if you have to. But many of the modern cemeteries, such as the privately owned cemeteries that are out there for business purposes, they will have the maps of the individuals, where they are buried, in what sections of the cemeteries. And some of these cemeteries, they don't have stones. Some of the individuals were buried without headstones. The family did not want to supply a headstone for whatever reason, and so you'll have to have a map because you're not going to find them.
Before a genealogist comes to the cemetery, it's always helpful to have the date of death, and from that we can go to our records very quickly and then find the grave location. But if you do not know the date of death, we do have an alphabetical listing of all the interments, so we can find it in that way.
I have 3 instances where there are people buried there where there's no marker. One of these graves has 26 people in it, and there are only 4 markers. So always check the cemetery records. Very interesting.
Not only that, there's pictures of the grave site. Frequently, the sexton will have a picture of where he buried someone.
The drawing, the sketches.
The sketch, and she found one of her ancestors through that. And we've now erected a granite marker on that site.
Grave markers can be as mortal as the ancestors they honor. And while some have lasted for centuries, many more are lucky to survive 100 years.
As real as that headstone will be, it may be almost illegible. All sorts of things wear on it. Time, of course, will wear on it. The weather wears on it. Vandals come and do nasty things to it. Thoughtless people do things to it. Another burial going by, people can accidentally knock on it, chip a bit off or whatever. So be aware that when you do go to the cemetery, the headstone may not be perfectly legible for you.
Mother Nature may not give headstones much consideration, but there are those who do. In Great Britain, for example, there's groups of people that come together to save headstones from oblivion by transcribing the memorial inscriptions on them.
We section all the churchyard off into little parcels of land, if you will. When you get to the old section, they could be absolutely anywhere. Not in any formation. You could find someone under a tree, someone else this way on. So then it gets difficult. So you have to do it in sections rather than as a whole thing, so as people know exactly the little bit that you mean. Most of the stones have at least the family on there. They have who the husband or wife or children, what happened to them. It would say how they died. It would say where they died. It would say on there the country that they came from. It perhaps wouldn't say that in the register. It would just say the name, the date and the age. So we think this is very, very important. So what we do in the first stage is we all have a stone to transcribe. We have pen and paper and we just do it word for word. We go right down as far as we can. If it is unreadable, we will chalk it and get the information. The new stones are easy to read. The old ones, a lot of them have already eroded with the weather and age. This one is 1864 and it's not too bad. If you put the chalk on it, it will bring the words out as you see. It doesn't damage the stone. It doesn't do any damage whatsoever. The rain just washes it away. The wind will blow it away. And then it's exactly as how we found it. So if you want to find William Blyton, if he belonged to you, you would look in the index, you would look for the B, look for Blyton. There may be 10 Blytons in this churchyard. They'll all be there, and it will have all this information when you turn to that letter. If anyone is trying to find ancestors, of course go to the archives, but if at all they know the shire or the county or wherever their people came from, try and find the history group that is in that area, because more than likely they're doing this. If somebody doesn't do it, it's going to be lost forever. There's many people out there that are interested in this sort of thing. If we don't do it, it's gone.
By using these same procedures, you can save the vital information on your ancestors' gravestones as well. Just remember to get the proper permission before you begin. Now, what if you can't actually travel to the cemetery yourself? Well, maybe you can go there online.
Cemetery records online range from everything from just indexes of cemetery listings to actual lists of transcribed tombstones. In some cases, you'll find that volunteers are going to put some of this information online on their personal website, and in other cases, you find that a society has put up an entire database. One that I'm real familiar with is the Ontario Cemetery Finding Aid. This is a database of more than 2 million internments in Ontario cemeteries. It's very easy to search, and when you get the results back, it tells you a little reference number, the county, and the cemetery name where this person is buried. And the reference number refers you to one of the branches of the Ontario Genealogical Society. You can then go contact them to find out more about that particular burial. So this is all available to you from your home. It's an amazing thing.
I never would have imagined that this day in the county could have given me so much, and that I just felt as if I'd been given this real gift of, that he had become alive somehow.
And lo and behold, now we actually are standing on the soil where that person is buried, and somehow it brings a life to them. There is a feeling in a cemetery that is not just a sacredness, but there is also a bond.
Cemetery records can reveal a lot more than just the date of death. They can even lead to your ancestors' grave sites, providing a physical connection to those who have died. And that's what it's all about, discovering your family and connecting with your ancestors.
It was a very rewarding moment because there had been so few records of him, no photographs, nothing, and here at least he was. It was a very, very important moment for me. I was just so grateful to find him.
Next time on Ancestors.
More than 100 years ago, a representative of the U.S. government, a census taker, knocked on the door of my grandfather's home to solicit information for the census. And as a result of that meeting, a record was created, and it was a record that I never even knew existed. That information opened the door to my family history.